Okay, it's getting towards 5 past, so I think I'll get started. So, welcome everyone to the sociology presentation for 2022. I'm Liam and I'm assisted by Susan, who you'll both meet soon. And yeah, before I begin, I would love to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we are gathered on today. I pay my respects to the elders past and present, for they hold the memories, the traditionals, the culture and hope of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples across the nation, as well as that I'm zooming on from Wathaurong land. So some of you who may be from Melbourne may be coming from Wurundjeri land. So yeah, just since this is a sociology presentation, also very good to acknowledge this as well. Before I also begin, a little extra is the Zoom etiquette. So as you have noticed by now, we are in webinar mode. So we will be monitoring the chat though, so don't feel excluded at all. Use the Zoom chat for immediate questions only, like tech difficulties, or when asked to participate, which we'll be doing a few little side activities to get you all engaged, as well as that use the Mentimeter for content-related questions and to engage in activities, as well as that in the event that there is a problem for Zoom, use the original link you were given to access the event. If the same link can't be used, sit tight, we'll be sending an update via email, of course. Okay, and I'll just switch onto the Menti, just so we all know what the code is. The code is 55837546. And if I'm not mistaken, Susan, would you be able to go on to the first question? I'm not sure how to...
I think you're the one that can do that. If you just kind of hover, an arrow should pop up allowing you to go to the next slide.
Okay.
There you go.
There we go, of course. Okay, now first question is, how are you all feeling about the sociology exam that's coming on? I'm pretty certain it's still the same format as previous years, so we'll be still giving you the same relevant information as last year. Okay, got some answers coming in. Okay, we have a lot of exhausted dogs, but we also have a happy dog. That's good. Yes, it's okay. I'm feeling the same. Susan, what did you put?
Well, I'm not doing the sociology exam for obvious reasons. I did the studious dog though. Look at him go.
Yes. I'm feeling the happy dog as well. I think whoever voted, I feel you on this one. Okay. Now that we'll move on. So just for short introductions, I'm Liam. I graduated in 2020 from Northern Bay College as Dux and from the Skyline program. I'm soon to be a final year student at Deakin University. I love listening to the radio and writing. And my favorite muesli bar brand is Kind. I feel like I could eat, all the flavors are good. And I also may or may not be psychic. And when I say this, I have done this revision series lecture last year for sociology, made some quite accurate predictions about what was going to be on the exam, and then saw the exam last year. And I'm not saying anything, but I'm just saying that I do have a feeling for what could be assessed. So yeah, just some heads up. Susan?
Hi, everyone. I'm Susan. If any of you came along to English, you might remember me from there. I am in my final semester of Bachelor of Arts at Melbourne Uni in history. I also tutor English weekly at Skyline Hatch. I sadly didn't get to study sociology in VCE, but I've done quite a few sociology subjects at uni, which is why I'm here. So if anyone has any questions about studying it at uni, you can definitely hit me up in the Mentimeter Q&A. Aside from that, I really love my dog. That's Jack there on the slide. He's back home with my family in Warrnambool, but love visiting him whenever I can. And aside from that, really love music as well. So yeah.
Oh my gosh, that's lovely. Thank you so much, Susan, and love Jack as well. So what the session outline, what we're doing today is we'll start off with some hot exam tips, just so we all get the good stuff first, and then we'll move into kind of a refresher of Aboriginal Indigenous culture. So what you've learned at the start of the year, and then almost backtrack. And then what we'll do is have a break at 4:55 p.m. for 15 minutes, and then essentially do the second area of study for Unit 3, which is ethnicity, and then Unit 4, which is community, and then another break, and then we'll wrap up with social movements, which I'm sure it's all fresh in your minds, but just good to have that extra revision because it will be on the exam. Okay, now moving on. For exam tips, we have, just so you all may not know about what you're going to be in for the sociology exam, make sure to note down this date. It's on the 8th of November at 2 p.m. So it starts at 2 p.m. and ends 4:15 p.m. And what the layout will be is a half of section A, and then half of it will be section B. And this is weighted 50% of your overall grade. What you'll have to complete the exam is 2 hours and then the 15 minutes reading time at the start. And now this is just my thoughts about it, but since you have 2 hours, I think it's best to almost dedicate 1 hour for each section on the exam. So you're evenly using your time on what the content will be for the exam, if that makes sense. And what to help prepare you for the exam, I think it's best to do a lot of practice questions, but also complete with your notes and then try practicing without your notes. For section A, what there will be 8 short answer questions, a lot of representation analysis, and then section B, which is 4 extended essay style answers required. These are your 10 markers. So this makes up 40 marks of your total exam. And then to help consolidate your knowledge and familiarity, you need to also kind of just reflect on this past year and collect your sacks back as well, I think is my best advice. And just focus on what your strengths are and what your weaknesses are. And always best to, of course, focus on your weaknesses and then turn them into strengths. And then as well as this, we also have flashcards. So with the definitions, we'll soon have a little activity where we can make sure you're all sharp with your definitions, memorize your case studies. So there should be 4 case studies that you'll all have covered this year, which is your Australian Indigenous culture issue, your ethnic group, your specific community, and social movement. And with that, it's always good to remember the quotes related to those case studies and then the exact dates of events that may have happened. You always want to try and stand out from the crowd as best you can and just show your examiner that you do understand the content very well. And then with that, using your reading time to just read through the representations and kind of understand, what concepts they may be asking for, if that makes sense. And then with that, of course, like I said previously, 1 hour to each section. And then for section B, with the 4 essay style questions, I suggest to practice writing for 15 minutes for each case study, if that makes sense, and then almost tailor it to what the exam question will be asking for. And then final point, which should sound obvious, but try to get some sleep. You don't understand how much sleep means. I'm sure Susan can have a little extra note on that. Sleep is so important.
Yeah, couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
Definitely just sleep.
Yep. And then 4 key terms. So when you are doing the exam, you're going to be asked, either evaluate, analyze, compare, outline, examine, explain, state, define, all these key terms, right? And I don't want you to all, get tunnel vision over this and almost get worried looking at an evaluate or an analyze. Think of this as just a tool, use it as a tool to best guide your study for the lead up to the exam. I would suggest focusing on practicing your evaluate and your analyze, because even though they might be the most difficult, they will be worth the most marks in the exam. And these are your typical section B questions. And with that, to break it down, evaluate is essentially, it requires the highest knowledge and critical thinking, where you look at the pros and you look at the cons of, whatever the case study might be, and you have to evaluate and you have to put forward your argument. And then just to note with that as well, for define, I put brackets, this is a given, because for all of section A, with all the questions that they ask, you will have to define. And what this means is you just have to give the definition of, to show your examiner that you understand, you have to define the concept. So whether that is ethnic hybridity or, Gemeinschaft or Gesellschaft, giving out that definition shows that you understand the concept. And now getting started, we're going to move on to our first activity. So using the chat box, I would love to know what number is sociological imagination. What number is it? Out of all the definitions, which number is it? I'll give you some time to read. 4? Okay, beautiful. I think we're all confident on 4. Amazing. So yep, that's correct. And then what about culture? 5? Okay, beautiful. We're all switched on. And then reconciliation? 6? Yep. And then ethnocentrism? Yes, beautiful. Number 3. And then cultural relativism? Yep, number 1. And then ethnicity? There's only a few remaining. 7, yep. And then that leaves ethnic hybridity as 2. Okay, beautiful. Just got to clear this. Give me a moment. Okay, beautiful. And if you don't have access to the slides, I'll give you all 10 seconds to screenshot. I think this is definitely really good to have in your notes. Definitely, turn it into flashcards and use it as a study resource, because with the flashcards, I think it's just really good to, write this, for an exam question, it might ask you, it won't ask you specifically, but it'll ask you about ethnicity. And I think it's always good to just have that definition ready, and you can just write it you can answer the exam question with the definition, 1 point. And then now again for unit 4, now I'm hoping we all get this right. So for community, 5, yep. And then Gesellschaft. This one was always tricky. Remembering year 12. 4, yep. Ooh, yep, it's 4. And then Gemeinschaft. 2, yep. Beautiful, yep. And then social movement. Yep, beautiful. That's 1. And then deprivation theory. 6, yep. And then new social movements theory. 3, yep. Okay, beautiful. Okay, good. We're all switched on. you're all going to do amazing. And that leaves the Max Weber's theory of power as 7, so directly next to it. Okay, beautiful. And then once again, I'll give you 10 seconds. Once again, screenshot it. Beautiful resource. Yeah, and it can be some easy marks on the exam. Okay, hopefully we've all screenshotted it, because now that leads into the content for today, which, if you can't remember it, that's why we're here, and that's why this presentation is happening. So starting off culture, we have 2 concepts, material culture and non-material culture. Material culture is essentially just, the physical objects that help identify a culture, tools, weapons, utensils, etc. For Aboriginal Indigenous culture, it's, a humpy, for example. And non-material is the abstract ideas and ways of thinking that may make up a particular culture, so like beliefs, norms, etc. And for Aboriginal Indigenous culture, this is the dream time. And the dream time is essentially the pinnacle of religion and culture. And it explains, the story of how life has occurred, essentially almost analogous to the Bible. Anyways, with that in hand, there's also ethnocentrism versus cultural relativism. And to explain ethnocentrism and cultural relativism, if you are getting mixed up on these terms, ethnocentrism means, no, essentially. It's evaluating and passing judgment on another culture by using the evaluator's own culture as a frame of reference for correct way of living. So just thinking of yourself as superior. And for example, the synonyms would be prejudice, intolerance, bigotry, or discrimination. And the opposite of this is cultural relativism, which is, almost relating to someone even if they're outside of your culture. So it involves attempting to understand a person's beliefs and practices based on that person's own culture, and it promotes understanding and acceptance. So when you are taking a culturally relative stance, you are almost, ignoring what you actually think about, a certain topic or whatever it may be, and just being open-minded. For example, like looking at this picture, you might think, oh, that's strange, like why is she wearing that? That would be ethnocentric of you. Or if you were culturally relative, you'd look at it and be like, I understand that this is a part of their norms and their traditions, and you don't say anything of a rude nature, if that makes sense. And that leads on to the sociological imagination, which complements these 2 concepts, where it's an analytical approach to have awareness of the world's influence, past and present, from a new alternative point of view to understand the connection between personal challenges and public issues. And to note as well, it's by C. Wright Mills, and that's in the study design. So please, when you are defining this or explaining it, always include C. Wright Mills. And it helps sociologists grasp a better understanding of how people interact with society. Engaging in sociological imagination requires you to think sociologically. What that means is just you need to adopt a culturally relative viewpoint when you are engaging in the sociological imagination. If you are, let's say, ethnocentric, going back to this slide, you aren't engaging in the sociological imagination. So it's always good to just have those 2 concepts connected. And with this, well, even though I've kind of explained this slide, just the relevance to the 2 concepts. So once again, in the study design, it asks for this: the bias, stereotypes, generalizations, skew analysis to engage in the sociological imagination. Having an ethnocentric perspective will not help sociologists understand and broaden your views on how 2 aspects in society are linked. So you're kind of being closed-minded and you aren't able to understand the why or the how. So using your personal views and having a prejudice will limit how we come to understand society's influence. This is not ideal. And with that, just a quick little exam question that I've attached. This was from, I think, 2016. Even though it's outside the study of design, it still asks, explain how to use the sociological imagination and how to connect those two concepts. And then with Indigenous Australians and misconceptions, there are three that are, ideal to remember. And that's living in dry, arid areas, land belonging to no one prior to British colonisation, Australian Indigenous people sharing one culture and that they're all the same and, they're not different, they're homogenous. And obviously we know these three misconceptions aren't true because the facts are that Indigenous Australians actually, a lot of them do live in Melbourne. And for that terra nullius that the British used, Indigenous Australians have been on the land for 65,000 years. And as well as that, they've had cultural customs established on the land through the formation of tribes and having ceremonies unique to each land, each clan. And as well as that, I'm sure you've all seen that map of seeing all the languages throughout Australia. So obviously there has been this establishment of culture and customs. And with that, the diversity is so huge in, this Indigenous population that there's actually 500 nations and there's more than 200 languages spoken. So there's a great diversity and I feel like seeing two different Indigenous people, they probably are from a different clan. And that leads into the history of the Indigenous Australians. We have historical suppression. So that's just, when the British first invaded, Indigenous people were viewed as subhuman and they were seen as primitive and the savage noble race, the inferior race. And British colonizers wanted to Christianize and civilize, removing Indigenous peoples from their family. This was the stolen generation. And with the segregation policy, there was a lot of reserves, church-run missions, and they're also banned and forbidden to preserve their own culture. Indigenous Australians were also raised with that, those Christian values and forced to speak English and almost, adopt English as their main language and forget everything else. So to wipe out their culture, essentially. And with that, there's an assimilation policy. And that is when Indigenous were forced to have the same manner of living as British to have citizenship. And this is actually called the Native Citizenship Rights Act of 1944. It's a policy you might want to remember for the exam. And just to apply for Australian citizenship, Aboriginal people had to prove they had severed ties with their Aboriginal family and friends. They were free from disease, can speak English, been civilized in behaviour for 2 years, could manage their affairs, and then were industrious in their habits. The citizenship weren't granted down to their children as well once Indigenous were granted citizenship. So you can just note how the past atrocities have really shaped how that we have now the Closing the Gap campaign, if that makes sense. And with material culture and non-material culture, it's also good to note the ethnocentric and culturally relative viewpoints of these things that may be requested in the exam, such as for ethnocentric historical artifacts, you may want to include as a reference, as an example, artwork by Robert Dowling depicting Indigenous Australians as a master. As you can see on the right, they were forced to adopt European culture. And as well as that, the ill wills of Indigenous Australian people and the atrocities, it's still going on today. So we also have a contemporary example, which is Adam Goode's harassment and being called an ape. And for the flip side, for culturally relative, you have the Christian Thompson photograph, so showing Australian Indigenous people in a positive light, almost, this photograph here, it's a lot more better than the photograph in the top right corner. And it highlights the loss of identity for Indigenous Australians, where many of his works actually focus on Australian Indigenous culture, which is really amazing. And we also have The Final Quarter, the documentary of Adam Goodes and how he actually experienced racism in the footy. And with that, you have John King and his experience on the Burke and Wills expedition. So where he had such a positive experience with the Indigenous community. And that moves on to the Freedom Rides. So the Freedom Rides is a positive experience of Indigenous people where it was led by Charles Perkins in 1965. And it was an organised protest in the New South Wales aimed to highlight the poor living and social conditions facing the Indigenous people. It addressed the racism and social inclusion experienced by Indigenous people, and the response was effective in that it raised awareness about Australian culture and the climate surrounding Indigenous Australians, and that despite all the drawbacks, it still helped win a yes vote at the landmark 1967 referendum to include Indigenous in the Australia's official population census. So that just means before 1967, they weren't actually counted as people. And then with that, there's also the apology. And I actually haven't seen a lot of questions regarding the apology on the exam, but it may ask you for evidence of historical suppression and what the government may have done. So the apology was in 2008, and the former Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, delivered an apology directed to the stolen generation in Parliament. It was broadcasted on national TV. Everyone, witnessed this. And as well as that, it was also an example of symbolic reconciliation, where it was a kind, compassionate gesture that assists the healing process of the victims of the stolen generation, as they experienced a great loss of culture and kinship among each other. And it promoted awareness of Australian Indigenous culture by, of course, broadcasting it and everyone witnessing it. Just to note as well, with symbolic reconciliation, it's very much different from practical reconciliation. And that's the government policies directed towards improving the socioeconomic circumstances of Indigenous people. But symbolic is just the talking aspect, and it's not really anything, no policies are put in place, if that makes sense. And that leads into an example of practical reconciliation, and that's Closing the Gap campaign, for example. This is also in the study design, where it's a government action / policy that aims to reduce Indigenous disadvantage and inequalities within 25 years, made in 2018, so the same year as the apology by the Rudd government in response to the 2005 Social Justice Report. And once again, an example of practical reconciliation, really good to remember for the exam. And basically the six focuses of the Close the Gap campaign is HEHE, I like to remember. So health, education, early childhood, housing, economic participation, and employment. Really good to have these, on hand, because when you are writing about the Closing the Gap campaign, you can only say so much without really talking about nothing, if that makes sense. So it's always good to really address and be very meticulous with what the Closing the Gap campaign focuses on. And then I'm sure all you have done a SAC on this already. And just to put in the chat, did we all do change the date for our Australian Indigenous issue? Yes? No? Alice, what did you do? Because I feel like everyone does change the date. And Sophia, what did you do? Uluru Climb. Oh, yep. Okay, that makes sense. It's okay. I still added a little something in here, I'm pretty sure. Anyways, for those who have done this, you will be getting a little extra. And for Sophia and, sorry, there's a lot of responses. Alice, you can still have this in mind as well. So for the Australian Indigenous culture issue, change the date. Basically, the 26th is the day of the mourning for Indigenous Australians, yet known to be the celebration of Australia. And basically, 1778, Governor Arthur Phillip raised the Union Jack at the Sydney Cove. And with that, the British introduced laws and policies that led to dispossession and cultural suppression of Indigenous people. The campaign uncovers Australia's dark colonial past and increases understanding on why Indigenous people oppose the date. There's a lot of controversy on this. And then as well as that, an increased awareness that have shaped public views through polls, for example, for those who would like to, have evidence for their case study to remember, there has been a little Vox Pox or whatever it's called, just the ABC's survey, and the responses for Australia Day should not be celebrated on January the 26th, given the historical significance of that date for Indigenous people. In 2019, 40% disagreed. So they were kind of like, it should be celebrated on that day. But then 2 years down the track, it's actually decreased 33%. So almost the gap, or more people being aware, you can see the public views and you can understand the public awareness through the change in these two polls, if that makes sense. A really good evidence to have. And then with that, we have examples of Australian Indigenous representation. So really good takeaway. We're going to be practicing one as well. So don't fret if you can't do it like at this very second. But on the left, we have politicians react to Pauline Hanson's walkout during acknowledgement of country. Is she being ethnocentric? Is she being culturally relative? A really good read to have. And as well as that, on the right corner, while you can't hike Australia's Uluru, aka Ayers Rock, here's why it's sacred and how to tour it. So we're kind of seeing that almost change, and we're seeing a culturally relative stance, as we're not promoting the climb of Uluru, but we are actually promoting how to tour it and how to understand more about Indigenous Australian culture and things alike. And then, of course, you have the ethnocentric cartoon in the bottom right, where it says, Sheila's, you give them an enriching cultural experience, and what thanks do you get? It's a Bill Leakes cartoon, and obviously it's the most vile and racist thing that you'll ever see. But you can just highlight and see how that Bill Leakes is demonstrating a very ethnocentric perspective. And that leads to our little activity. So we have an activity here, and we'll just use the Zoom chat for this, but I would love to hear what you all think about this cartoon. I'll read it. And it says, there's one policeman holding an Indigenous child, and then there's almost the dad of the child, right? And it says, you'll have to sit down and talk to your son about personal responsibility. And then the dad replies, yeah, righto, what's his name then? And fun fact, this was published in The Australian, so a national newspaper, in 2016. I'd love to have you all just write in the chat, in the Zoom chat, what's the main issue being addressed in the cartoon? What's the intended audience? Is it Indigenous or is it non-Indigenous? And is it ethnocentric or culturally relative? And how do we know this, if that makes sense? And then with that, I'd love to know, looking at the cartoon and analyzing it almost like it's English, right? What misconceptions are being reinforced? Plays into stereotypes surrounding Aboriginal people. Yep, definitely. Neglecting their kids and being alcoholic. Yep, it's all of those things. Yeah. And what stereotypes can you see, like almost reflecting on the misconceptions? What stereotype is it? Yeah, Andrea, Rania, good. Yep. Yep. You're all spot on, and I really love the responses coming in. Essentially, what we're looking at is almost like it's depicting Aboriginal people as not knowing about their children and not having any role in raising their children. So it almost says that Aboriginal people are negligent and that they actually can't take care of their kids. And it almost is it's a great caricature, like the emphasis on the lips and, just almost like this dark shadowing on the characters, almost making them look dirty. And as well as the dad, he has an alcohol in his hand, a VB, and no shoes. So the main issue being addressed is youth custody, alcoholism, and then degradation of family and culture, and especially values as well. And then with the intended audience, it's definitely not Indigenous. I think Indigenous people seeing this, it's very harmful. And even as a non-Indigenous person, it is harmful. And it's an ethnocentric negative portrayal. You're all spot on. And I actually love what Alice put in the chat as well, like using commas uncivilized, because that's so true. And then with misconceptions, dry outer areas, spot on. And then how does this affect the audience? And this is your step. This is almost like the second step of the analysis, which you should, to attain the full marks, it's always good to have. And it's just, how does it limit the public awareness and views on Australian Indigenous culture? Are we promoting or endorsing Indigenous Australians in a positive light? Obviously not for this case. And then what stereotypes / generalizations are enforced? Are we, reinforcing what misconceptions? And then are we, saying that they're being primitive or living in dry, arid areas? All those things. So yeah, really good responses. On the flip side though, I want to make sure that we also have a little positive representation. So this is a takeaway. So we have Channel 10 commended for NAIDOC weather segment using traditional names for Australian cities. So Channel 10 has been applauded for using the traditional names, as we can all see. And then we have NAM, so that's Melbourne. And then essentially, once again, we need to almost go through these set of questions, like in our heads. Is it ethnocentric or is it culturally relative? What's the intended audience? How are Indigenous Australians referenced? Are we seeing them as positive people or negative people? And I think a good tip with this is if it's coming from an Indigenous person, the article or whatever it may be, then it's most likely going to be culturally relative if the person writing the article or the representation is Indigenous. Because I know on the exam that they aren't going to give you like a representation about Indigenous people from an Indigenous person saying something negative or, harmful. I think it wouldn't make sense. So yeah, once again, also a good side note is that with this representation, are we endorsing or challenging reconciliation? So are we feeling good about the ties with Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people? Or do we feel like this is causing a greater divide? Are we being divisive? And then let's just play this quick video before break.
Hi, my name is Josh, and I'll be taking you through the Literature Exam Revision Series for this year. We're going to cover everything literary perspectives and close analysis, looking at the way high-scoring students maximise their marks and how best to tackle your books.
Okay, before we go on to break, I'll just quickly answer this question from Fatima. So for this example, I think Lexi Cartwright, I'm just assuming, she might not be Indigenous, she could be, but for this example, Bill Leaks, it's obviously from someone who's not Indigenous. So I wouldn't expect an Indigenous person to make this, if that makes sense. But there might be on the exam a representation like this actually coming from an Indigenous person. So we can straight away just be like, no, it's not ethnocentric, if that makes sense. I hope that clears it up. But yeah, if that, yeah, okay, good. Okay, and we'll do a break now. And then, yeah, we'll spend 15 minutes. So we'll come back at 6. So see you all then. Okay, welcome back everyone. I'll just quickly play this video and then we'll do a Q&A. So if you still have the Menti open, definitely add some extra questions and then we'll just do this after the video.
Hi, my name's Susan and I'm one of the English tutors here at Skyline Hatch, and I'll be running the Ransom and the Queen Masterclass for comparative text response. This masterclass is essentially just a deep dive into Ransom and the Queen. So we'll kind of look at analysing each text separately, then we'll look at some really good examples of comparisons to answer different essay prompts, and we'll also look at some high scoring and low scoring essay responses to Ransom and the Queen comparative prompts. I hope to see you there.
Lovely. Thank you, Susan. Okay, and now it's time for Q&A. I think I'll just drag my Menti over. I have one question and I don't know who it's from, but thank you so much for this question. It asks, what is your advice for writing the long answer questions? I find it hard to finish them all in time. Okay, really great question. And I'm assuming you're referring to section B, so all the long answers, like all the long answer responses. And what I would suggest for practice right now till before the exam is to, just practice writing essays within 15 minutes, because essentially they are essays, if that makes sense. So what you'd do is you'd practice with notes and then without. So you'd use your examples from case studies, dates, all of that. And it's also, even if you don't have them back yet, I suggest that you grab all your SACs back from your teachers, because they are probably the most relevant and useful study resource that you can have, because you have all the work there, you have all the information there. It's just a matter of practicing really, really fast and getting through all those questions. Susan, would you like to add anything back from your global politics days?
No, I actually think you've covered it really well. That's pretty much what I did. For those of you watching, I did do global politics, which has a very similar format with the short and long answer questions. And I'd say, yeah, definitely just like having all of my examples for all of the different, like concepts you could be asked about. Once I had all my notes sorted, just doing practice questions. And I also, like you said before, I got all of my SACs back from throughout the year and looked back at my old answers, like saw where I could maybe improve, and then, wrote practice questions and got feedback from my teacher. Getting feedback is the main thing, so you can continuously improve on your writing.
Yep, definitely. I forgot that part. Definitely get feedback on your writing after you complete the practice questions. And I hope that helps. But just remember that it's good to allocate 15 minutes, like as a window for the short answer. So practice within that time, or even just using a little bit extra time and then shortening it after you continue to practice. Where should I begin with revising for sociology? So what I would suggest best is to look at the previous 3 exams, so 2019, 2020, and 2021. Because this is the last year of the study design, I'll look through all the VCAR questions and then begin with those, and then look back at your answers and the reports that they generate from that, and then almost use those two as a way to allocate marks and give yourself feedback, as well as presenting it to your teacher and asking feedback from them on how you can improve, and also improve the fluency and just how to articulate your thoughts as concise as possible, if that makes sense.
I might just quickly add to that. The only thing would be, if you're still feeling a little bit uncomfortable with some of the content, I would just advise like revising that before you jump into practice questions or looking over the exams. Like, I think sometimes people jump into questions too early and then they freak out and think they don't know how to do them, but it's just that they need to, just go over the content. So definitely, you don't want to spend too much time rewriting notes, but if you go back and find that you've got like gaps in your notes, or you haven't got everything easily accessible where you can go, right, there's my definition, there's my example for that concept. Spend some time just getting all of that sorted so you know that you've got everything kind of there, and then you can start applying that to questions and practicing.
Yep, definitely. And I think as well as this presentation, just even glancing over it's a little vague, but the study design is almost the most useful thing as well, because it is an indicator of what you need to know, since the exam is going to be based off the points in the study design. Should we complete section A or B first? Would it be better to get the essay style questions completed first? I did section B first. So to the second point, I think it's better because I felt like you're almost jogging your memory back from all the concepts that you have started from, like, let's say, because section B is 4 questions and the first question will be relating to Australian Indigenous culture, writing a whole essay on that in 15 minutes. And then after the 15 minutes goes by, then it's time to do your question 2 of section B, which is usually culture. And then the third question of section B, which would be community. And then the final question / essay is going to be social movement. So I feel like writing it all out and then having almost all your examples and case studies come through in the essay, section A is kind of like just using, almost like reflecting on the knowledge that you've pulled through from your memory and just answering those questions, if that makes sense. Is it close the gap or closing the gap? That's a good question. I'm pretty certain it's close the gap campaign, but there are two, but I think it's close the gap campaign, and it has the official policy, if that makes sense. But there is also closing the gap, if that makes, like, there's 2, but it's close the gap campaign, pretty sure. Are you guys able to predict what the 10 market questions might be based on, like any clues or hints? I got this question last year. I'm not too certain. It would be very hard to predict something and then give you all a bum steer, but I would just assume that, like, everything from your case studies will be relevant, if that makes sense. And it'll probably be for question, like the first question of part B would definitely be about public awareness or public awareness, or like the views, like public views on AIC. Once again, I don't write the exam. And then for for question 2, part B, it'd be culture. So it'd have to be relating to whatever ethnicity you studied. So I don't have the specifics, but just look through the study design. It's there for you, and you can just continue to practice, if that makes sense. Susan?
I'm going to jump in there. Obviously, I'm not sure because I didn't do this subject, but I know when I did global politics, it was also the last year of the study design. And so my teacher could like kind of predict what the questions were kind of going to be on by looking at what hadn't been done in the past few years. Is that kind of what you're talking about here?
Yeah. I was going to say you definitely, like, my best guess would only be stuff that hasn't been touched recently. So 2019 rehashed. So look at 2019's exam as a refresher. But once again, I'm not that psychic. How much should we be writing for each 10 marker? How many pages? As much as the writing space gives, you can do extra space if you need. But for what I did 4 to 5 paragraphs. So the introduction, and then 2 or 3 body paragraphs, and then the conclusion. It just depends on it just depends on the time constraints of how fast you can write. But I managed to pull out 4 or 5 paragraphs for each of the questions. And that's why I suggest starting part B, like section B first, because you kind of have that strength in your hand, if that makes sense, to go through it all. What should we memorize? Case study names. What you should memorize is definitely the case studies, all the theories, all the definitions to the theories, and then of the case study, just remember your dates and like events and important examples relating to the case study that you can pull as arguments for your like essay for section B, if that makes sense. Okay. Is think white, act white, be white a good quote to use? Definitely 100%. And if so, what kind of question would it be likely be for? So I think for what it might ask, and I've seen this a lot, is almost asking how Australian Indigenous people have been like how, like, what is evidence for, it won't say explicitly what's the evidence, but it'll ask about historical suppression, or it might ask about things relating to the negative impact of Australian society. And then you can just say, well, there have been policies and there has been that social Darwinism and all of those things supporting that, and how we want a Snow White Australia as well. That's also another good quote. And yeah, the think white, act white, be white is all, you can all just tie it in and use it as an example. And I'll just say this will be, we're going to do another question time, but let's just blaze through the content and then get the next break, and then we'll go through more.
Just a quick question, Liam. Where is that think white quote from?
I'm not sure who asked this, but if you did ask this, put it in the chat because it's really good to know. I know, I'll put it in the chat, but there was a quote saying like, we want a Snow White Australia. And I think that is, once again, it's supporting the White Australia policy. And it's also kind of, yeah, it's related to ethnicity, I'm pretty sure. So we'll just quickly jump back to presentation and we'll blaze through this content. Really good about the questions though. Really good to know that you're all keen. Okay, now we're moving on to ethnicity. So with ethnicity, the most important concept to know is there's going to be a study dot point with race versus ethnicity and what's the difference. This has been on last year's exam, but the possibility of it showing up is still the same, if not a little bit less, but also good to know. So with the concept of race, it promotes stereotypes / an ethnocentric perspective to the study of cultural groups. It promotes it promotes a racial hierarchy where the term race may be used to create barriers and harm, where a race may be viewed greater than the other. So white Australia policy, for example, think white, etc., where racial discrimination is maintained by power imbalances and inequalities. So you have that social Darwinism where white people are the best, and we're like, it's just, once again, it's that ethnocentric perspective. And with ethnicity, it's more so the recognized identity of an individual's experiences rather than the biological characteristics. And this is, of course, what sociologists prefer, because obviously if someone looks white, well, you can't really tell what their ethnicity is. For example, like you look at an Indigenous person and they may be white and you might be like, that's a white person. Well, obviously if they're Indigenous and they identify, it's about identity with ethnicity. It's not so what you look and see, if that makes sense. And then that leads on to ethnic hybridity, which is probably the most important concept here, where it's a process where individuals develop connections across cultural groups people identify with and choose elements of more than one culture that then forms a blended ethnic identity. So it's essentially two ethnicities, if that makes sense. And it just reflects that ethnicity is temporary and evolving, and people with Australia, it's very diverse. So there's Sudanese Australians, Greek Australians, Croatian Australians, Mary Christus, who is a Greek Australian, and then we have Ando, famous Vietnamese Australian. And then with diversity, this was assessed last year as well. So hopefully you don't need to remember these figures, but once again, it's still on the study design. It hasn't been removed. So with diversity, these are all figures from ABS, so Australian Bureau of Statistics in 2016. And you have to compare with another developed country. So for example, this is Japan that has been compared. And with that, with Japan's diversity, you have a 98.5% Japanese ethnic group population, where it represents less than 5% migrants, just like Hungary and Korea. And then the lack of diversity can be explained by the immigration policies and humanitarian policies that don't exist there. Unlike Australia, which has a lot of programs to support immigrants to come to Australia, Japan has none. And they do this on purpose because they don't want to interrupt their monoculture, and they want to keep things the same, if that makes sense. The former Prime Minister Taro, so a good quote to have, good evidence to have, it's one nation, one civilization, one language, one culture, and one race. So it just reflects that Japan is very monocultural. It really doesn't want to change. It doesn't want immigrants. It just wants to be fully Japanese. Unlike Australia, which is the 9th largest population of international migrants in the world, and only just about more than half are born in Australia, and then 28% of the population are first-gen migrants, so born overseas, and then 20% have one parent born overseas. That includes me. And then with that, there's 300 languages spoken. You can only imagine in Japan, there's probably 1 or 2 languages spoken, right? And then with that, they actually have a lot of programs to support migrants. So AMAP, for example, which is free language classes to help learn English, and then just to help migrants integrate into Australia. And then with that, we have multiculturalism. So another study dot point, which describes the diverse cultural makeup of society, set of norms that uphold the right of the individual to retain and enjoy their culture. So it's a government policy seeking to recognize, manage, maximize the cultural diversity benefits, started in 2009. Migrants gain equal access to government-funded programs and services, once again, AMEP, for example, and it's founded on 4 central policy principles. So you want to commit to an inclusive society, respond to diverse needs, recognize economic prosperity of multiculturalism, and condemn intolerance and discrimination. For example, really good evidence to have, but we have the Racial Discrimination Act 1975. And this is a policy that essentially makes racism illegal. So what we're saying here is that multiculturalism is so supported that technically, if you are being racist, you can actually go to jail. And then with that, for the case study of this area of study, we have enablers versus barriers. I'm sure you all know this, but enablers, they are basically helping the ethnic group, assimilate into Australia, versus barriers, which, challenge or limit the ethnic group to go into and live peacefully in Australia, if that makes sense. And then there's 4 examples of barriers and enablers. So political, social attitudes, customs/traditions, and media. And I emphasize that it's good to have a total of 8 examples. So 1 barrier and 1 enabler for each. And for example, I've made this template that you can fill in. So I'll show you an example of how I did mine. I did Greek Australians, and this is it here. I would love to know, has anyone done Greek Australians, or what did everyone do? Tell me. This part's always interesting because usually, I had a choice on who I picked, but sometimes schools kind of just choose it for you. Oh, Italian Australians, Greek Australians, and Chinese Australians, Pakistani Australians. Oh, okay, interesting. German Australians, Chinese Australians. Yep. There's a lot of good information on Chinese Australians. So for Greek Australians, just to run through really quickly, good revision for Farah. So with enablers for Greek Australians, we had Greek Independence Day acknowledged by the Prime Minister. We've had Harmony Day, Greek language schools. There might be some overlap as well. There might be Chinese language schools in Australia, whatnot. And then celebration of cultural customs and traditions, Orthodox Greek churches. I'm sure there's Chinese churches and Croatian churches as well. And then there's multicultural policies. And then for media, which is really important, is that you have all this representation of Greek Australians. You have Wog Boy, Wog's Out of Work, Acropolis Now, and then, it's all on Australian TV and SBS. But with barriers, you have One Nation Party, anti-immigration laws being pushed, othering, racism, Reclaim Australia. I think that applies to all ethnic groups, where Reclaim Australia they just don't want immigration at all. And then, with this WOG slur as well. And then there's linguistic differences in language, which forfeit culture, having to assimilate, because with language barriers, of course, you're going to be claimed as other, and then traditional clothing not considered professionally appropriate. So, for example, in your case study, you might have someone who feels uncomfortable to wear traditional clothing. And then with that as well, for media, you have anti-Greek sentiment. You have Mary Koustas, the celebrity, talking about her experiences of racism in Australia. And then with that, you also have Golden Dawn, which is just basically the conflict in Melbourne between, Greek Australians and then, with independence as well. And then that moves on to ethical methodology. It was covered last year as well, but also could be on this year, or something relating to this, where ethical methodology is for both areas of study as well. And it's been made by TASA, so Australia Sociologists Association, and it provides this methodology guidelines on 5 principles, which are ethics, privacy, informed consent, voluntary participation, and confidentiality. So when you do fill out surveys, you are being cognizant and aware of what you're filling out. And it's really good for, collecting research and whatnot. And when you are doing the exam and you are filling out a question that is asking about ethical methodology, it's really good to hit all 5 points, if that makes sense. Because obviously you want the person filling out your survey to be most cognizant of what you're surveying, if that makes sense. So then that moves on to the representation. This is just another takeaway, as long as the next slide, but we also have, raising Aussies of a South Sudanese heritage, on the left of the article, and then on the bottom right, you have Tony Jones, who is defaming Croatian Australians and calling them extremists and terrorists. And with questions that will be on the exam, they're going to ask you, just when answering the questions, it's going to ask you about the issue that's being represented. So for raising Aussies of a South Sudanese heritage, it might be asking about their integration into Australia and their intended audience, who's being addressed. Is it an example of cultural hybridity, and getting that example in there and defining it? And then the effect on the audience. How does it affect the ethnic group? Is it negative or positive portrayal of that ethnic group? So referring to South Sudanese people who come to Australia and then refer to them as Aussies, you might be thinking, now they're one of us. And, we're combined and we're unison, and we feel more closer together, if that makes sense. And it's always good to explain how we can come to this analysis and be like, yep, that's a positive representation, or actually it's a negative because yada, yada, yada. And then with this one, this is very blatant, but this is another ethnicity representation, and it's asking second generation Australians find themselves caught between two worlds. So almost like the two worlds are conflicting. And for example, for this case study where this lady, Lucy, she just wanted a ham and cheese sandwich. So we're almost kind of seeing, that ethnic hybridity concept being applied here, if that makes sense, where you have Chinese, that Chinese background, and then you have that almost that Australian culture almost taking over. And then that's it for ethnicity. And we'll just jump back to questions. Okay. So for this question, how do you plan out what to write in questions to ensure all marks are met? So I feel like with the exam, you seriously, it is hard to, have this plan out. But I think what I did to try and get all the marks is just to understand, this is for section B, is that because it's worth 10 marks, what I did was I had to make sure that, like, when you do read the question, right, you are reading it and you are actually answering the prompt and tying that into what, the question is asking, if that makes sense. Because if you regurgitate what you have been practicing with another question from, last year's exam, the examiner can actually tell, if that makes sense. So what I would do before the exams is I just practice writing those questions, and I just got my teacher to look over it, and just I asked her how to improve. And I think with that, the questions are more so allocated on how cohesive the arguments are, if that makes sense. And with that, also having the structure as well, because I think there's going to be marks tied to the structure. So you don't want to be the person in the exam writing just senseless nonsense that goes on and on without paragraphs. So I definitely tried to aim for structured answers, but once again, just try to hit all the marks by having evidence to back up what you're saying. Susan, do you have anything to add?
No, I feel like you pretty much covered it there. I just totally back up everything you said.
Yeah. Is it important to follow a structure for the extended response in section B? If so, how did you structure your responses? Yeah, definitely. So how I did it for section B is for paragraph 1, so that's your introduction. Definitely for paragraph 1, your introduction, it will definitely be background, and then the issue of your case study pretty much, and then relating it, a linking sentence or two, relating it to whatever the question's asking, because obviously you want to tie it back to the question. I hope that makes sense for paragraph 1. And then paragraph 2, 3, your 2 body paragraphs, or third one, that will be your 3 arguments. So your 3 points that support your for or against for the question, and just backing it up by saying something new each time. And then your final paragraph will be your conclusion, which just summarizes everything you have said in the previous paragraphs. I understand it sounds trivial, but just trying your best to not repeat yourself and have arguments that make sense and kind of be succinct and not rambling. What's your best way to memorize key information? For me, it was flashcards, and just taking my facts back and deconstructing them. That's what I did personally. And then with that, it was just with deconstructing them, I just had dates, events, and just tried to memorize it through flashcards. Susan, anything to add?
Yeah, I use flashcards for things like definitions and stuff as well. And then it also just made me feel better to do kind of mind maps or things where I'd summarize each area of studies content in a small space. I could be right, I'm going to sit down and just be do I know the definition for all of these terms? Do I have an example, case studies, which just kind of helped me know that there weren't any gaps in my knowledge, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah. I think, writing it out is also really good, because then you're actually doing that active recall. For section A, is it better to write in dot points or just sentence paragraphs? Definitely sentences. Dot points would be very, very hard to it would be very, very hard to understand what you're saying if it's just dot points. So definitely sentences, and definitely try your best to structure your sentences as well. So if you can signpost after you say, yeah, this is ethnocentric, or this is an ethnocentric perspective, and then you would go on, because etc. Just make sure to signpost, and then through the use of the beer can, you can see how there is a reinforcement of the concept and misconception that Aboriginal people are alcoholics, for example. Relating it back to the first representation that we looked at. So yeah, definitely dot points, and definitely add that evidence as well for representation analysis. How much evidence is needed when responding to questions material covered this year, and what counts as evidence? Just quotes or anything that is given? So for representations, you can just quote the representation. So that would be your evidence. That would be section A, of course. And then for section B, your evidence is all the stuff you've looked at through your case study. So yeah, definitely quotes, events. I'm trying to think now. Yeah, pretty much quotes, events, even representations as well you can reference in your section B essay, because that can also talk about, for example, public awareness or public views. You can answer a prompt by including, yep, so the government has said this, and that's technically what you have practiced as a representation, if that makes sense. You mentioned that you roughly did 3 to 4 paragraphs in section B. How long was each of them roughly? Because last year's exam only gave a page and a bit for each question. So with the total of the essay, yeah, so for 4 paragraphs or 5 paragraphs in total, I think I did roughly 6 sentences, 5 or 6 sentences each paragraph. It might be give or take, because you might want to write more on certain thing, on your strongest argument, for example. But yeah, it was kind of 5 to 6 sentences, and it sounds bad, but don't do this, but just make sure you are using the extra pages to continue writing, because you don't want to write even beyond the lines. I have done that, and I don't suggest it because it does look a little bit convoluted. And then this will be the last question. What is your advice for writing the long answer questions? I find it hard to, yeah.
I think we've done that one. I think you might have gone through all of the answered ones.
Oh, okay, yeah. Okay, yes, that makes sense. Okay, good. Okay. So now we're going to be looking at community. So for community, let's go back onto Mentimeter and let's answer what is community. Just give me 1 second. Okay. What is community? And just, put out any words you can think of, any concepts you might have learned in sociology about what is community. Group, common interests, yep. A collective group, yep. Shared ideologies, yep. Shared belief, common interests. Tony's theory, yes. Live close, being in regular contact, shared history, regular contact, common beliefs. Yeah, this is all really good, and this is definitely what community, these are all the features of community, which is really amazing. And plus the sneaky concept in there, really good. Okay, and now with that, we have now classifying a community. So you've all hit the nail on the head. A community is a group of people who share a social relationship through being geographically close to each other and or being in regular contact with each other, and through having similarities such as mutual interests or shared ideology. So yes, that shared ideology, really good. For example, being geographically close, being regular contact, sharing similarities, mutual interests, shared ideologies, lifestyles, culture, ethnic groups, connection to an institution like a church community, school community, and shared government, such as Hume Council. And now moving on to the most important theory for this area of study, Ferdinand Tönnies' theories. He studied communities and their purpose in broader society during the Industrial Revolution, which shifted society to move into their inner cities for work. So there was a loss of close-knit life of the village based on ties centered around family, neighborhood, and church, and replaced by urban life. So you can see that industrialization coming in, and it's viewed as a lacking in depth and warmth, influenced by impersonal, superficial relationships. So we're going from Gemeinschaft to Gesellschaft. So first is Gesellschaft, and that is essentially community in German. And how I like to think of it as how I like to think of Gemeinschaft is that it's my community. So it has that mine in there. That's how I remember it. And it's defined as small, traditional, often rural societies consisting of close, familiar social relationships built on the basis of intimacy, support, and collective solidarity. And then over time, of course, with industrialization, populations become to expand and people move to the city now, and communities are urbanized and industrialized, and then resulting in, of course, Gesellschaft. And then Gesellschaft, I like to think of it as sales or selling something, or going to the shops and then buying something, but you actually don't know your cashier. And I'm sure in a Gemeinschaft community, you would know your cashier. So we don't know our cashiers. So that's how I remember Gesellschaft. It's a little convoluted, but it's defined as large, modern, often urban societies consisting of distant, impersonal interactions built on the basis of self-interest, personal gain, and individualism. So in the picture, it's very much city life, it's urban life, it's not that farm, rural type beat anymore. It's starting to become more of a modern society. And that's what Gesellschaft means in German. And then weighing it all up. So with evaluating, why might Gesellschaft might be more appealing than the other? Or why might we like Gemeinschaft more than Gesellschaft? So I'd love to hear your responses on which one you think is better. Of course, there is no wrong answer, but it's about providing me with the why. And I want, for an example, we'll have Susan tell me, do you prefer Gemeinschaft or Gesellschaft, and why?
Oh, it's so tricky because I feel like I will kind of flip-flop. Do you know what I mean? Sometimes you get lonely and you're like, I just want to live in a small town and just like go to the shop every day and see the local baker and then, and then sometimes I feel like I get overwhelmed and I'm like, I love my city life. I can just go and no one knows who I am. And like, I feel like if I had to pick one though, probably Gemeinschaft, because it's always nice to have community to rely on and make you feel supported.
Yes, yeah, that is so true. Like I always I'm not sure if you've experienced this, but I have like so many friends who go to the same cafe all the time, and like, the cafe person just knows their name. It's too Gemeinschaft for me. I think I'd rather have that anonymity and like do my own thing and live my own life. I'm not trying to be called upon in the cafe. I don't want people to know my name.
Yeah, some people really love that though.
Yeah, okay, that's fair. So we have Gemeinschaft, Gesellschaft, because I like the idea of meeting other people and being part anonymous to those around me. Yes, whoever said this, I'm rooting for you because we're the same person pretty much. I respect you. Gemeinschaft because a sense of belonging and intimate bonds. Yep, that's true. While Gemeinschaft is appealing for the close-knit feel of the community, it might be negative as it breeds exclusivity. Yes.
That's so true.
This is a really good response. Both would be needed, but I think Gemeinschaft is better because it's based on support and genuine relations instead of just being personal benefit. Yeah, definitely. Gesellschaft as the quality of life may be extended through increased opportunities such as employment so that you may earn a living. Yeah. These are really good responses. Gesellschaft, because individuals have the freedom to choose where they want to belong. Yeah, that is probably the pinnacle, and you've hit the nail on the head. With Gemeinschaft, you have to fit in. Gemeinschaft, it has a better sense. It feels more right to belong there. And then Gemeinschaft, as there is increased in available resources and often help one another. Yep. People care about each other in a Gemeinschaft community. I chose Gemeinschaft because it's more close-knit and having personal relationships with others is comforting. Yep. 100. Okay, these are really good. Thank you so much, everyone, for engaging. That was a really good exercise. And then with that, following on from that, with that evaluating, you might get a question on the exam, and it's asking the impact of ICT on a community and how that's changed. So with inclusion versus exclusion, ICT includes people by enabling people to connect with others from remote locations, like right now, or, you know, we can also readily access diverse ranges of people. So, you know, we might feel lonely in our Gemeinschaft community, but with ICT, we're kind of like expanding out and we can talk to pretty much anyone and join any communities online. But with exclusion, we have a lot of cyberbullying. So it's kind of making people feel excluded. And we also have these weaken or reduce social bonds that share locality or between members of the same communities. So we aren't really seeing people as much. Not a lot of people are leaving their homes, if that makes sense. And then people who aren't digitally literate or are part of the digital divide are excluded from, you know, ICT. They can't access it. So now they don't feel like they can belong. And then with that, there's online interactions could lead to isolation. So lack of face-to-face. Once again, COVID is a big example. With ICT present, it's now, you know, hard to see your friends. And then with that, there's a decreased sense of security due to cybercrime and online scams in communities. So I'm sure you've all heard of Optus recently. So that's kind of like, we're kind of feeling unsafe now. We kind of don't want to be a part of this ICT in the community. And then with that, there are actual platforms like online that promote hate groups and are racist. You know, Reclaim Australia Facebook group is an example, anti-immigration, but we also have pro-Anna communities or like neo-Nazi communities where they're just this cesspool of just negativity and just promoting wild ideologies. And then the factors that influence inclusion and exclusion are political, economic, geographical, and social. And I remember it as PEGS, so PEGS. And then we'll just move on quickly. For representations, so with community representations, I feel like they're a little different, but just for examples, we have parents at breaking point over high gate primary school student numbers. So because the schools are expanding and the communities are expanding, there's almost like this exclusion happening where parents can't fit in their kids at this primary school. And now the community feels bewildered and almost there's this angst and tension because, you know, they can't access school anymore. And same on the flip side, we have a new skate park opens in Geelong, right? So we're actually promoting social inclusion by we're having, you know, young people being able to come together and play and really promote that social inclusion. And as well as that, on the right, 7 Manly players to boycott NRL match over the gay pride jersey. So once again, another controversy, but now it's kind of has that intersectionality where it's kind of like we're excluding, you know, the LGBT plus community. And how does the other people in the NRL community feel about this? You know, what about the gay players? What about, you know, the trans players? So we have to think about it, who's being included, who's being excluded, and almost as well as that, the experience of, you know, such as the gay players in the NRL and then the 7 players, how do they feel? What's their experience in community? And then to help you analyze this, the questions that you need to be asking yourself is, what's the issue being represented? And then is it a Gemeinschaft or is it a Gesellschaft? And I think this theory, because it's pretty much the only one in this area of study, you need to ask yourself, is it Gemeinschaft or Gesellschaft? And then is there any experience of inclusion or exclusion in the community? So it's those three questions that are going to be forming your response. And then this tip is exam style questions will usually have introduced a factor that causes a change or shift in the inclusion and then or exclusion. And then it's good to also identify that. So for example, you have the new skate park, right? So looking at this slide, you just need to identify that there's an addition of the skate park or, you know, whatever it may be. It could be negative, like greater traffic congestion, more tourists, local cafe shuts down. And then how has the community before the change, like how has their experience been? How do they feel before they had that skate park? And then even after as well. And then how this change has affected its members' experience of community, that is inclusion and exclusion. So do we feel good about the skate park or do we feel bad about the skate park? I mean, obviously not, because the skate park is good, but what about the cafe shutting down or the ice rink shutting down? And then this is a takeaway, which I even designed some questions relating to this. And I found it, I hunted on Google for this, I scoured the internet, but it's this survey, not this survey, but this GoFundMe essentially, that are looking, it's a petition looking for signups on the Lismore City Council. So it's a community where they have this parkland and there's a developer that wants to build a whole new shopping center there. And then with that, the case is here. And then it even has responses where you might actually see this in the exam as well, where the responses are, Lismore's a beautiful place and it needs to keep its heart. Or you also have, we need to protect our parkland. So all these environmental values that the people in the community are expressing, such as public space is more important than commercial interests. So we're kind of pushing away all the commercialization, we're pushing away from the overdevelopment. And same with respondent D, Lismore has enough large stores, it needs more trees and gazebos, etc. So it's just good to identify, you know, the community and also their experiences. So for example, if it actually did put, you know, if they actually did build that large shopping mall, how would we feel about it now? How would people in the community feel? Like, would there be resentment? Would there be, you know, a lot of divisiveness and exclusion? And then that leads on to this, and we're approaching break.
Hey guys, my name is Chelsea and I'll be leading the Further Maths VCE exam revision series, where I'll be taking you guys through the core topics of Further Maths, which are data analysis and finance. And we'll be talking about all the tips and tricks that you guys need to know to be able to answer those questions, get full marks, and make sure you finish the exam on time. The exam revision series is the perfect opportunity for you guys to fine-tune your knowledge and ensure that you've covered all those dot points on the study design. It's also a great opportunity for you guys to get some extra advice and study tips for your exam preparation. What I like about Further Maths is that the content is relevant to real life, which means that after you guys have finished high school and you've left Further Maths behind, you'll find that a lot of the skills that you've learnt in Further Maths will carry on and transfer as life skills. And that's regardless of what career path you'll take. Most likely you'll see that those skills help you on a daily basis. Okay guys, my biggest tip for the end of your exams, which is also a tip that got me through high school, is that when you're preparing for exams, you want to make sure that the way you're preparing and doing practice exams is as close as possible to what the real situation is going to be like. And I don't mean just making sure that you do it under time conditions and that you also have your notes next to you. I mean setting out your table the way that you would on the actual exam day and making sure that you're used to the format of having reading time and having an open book notes if you have open book, and making sure that, you know, you have an isolated desk that's clean, just like the real one will be on your real exam day, to make sure that you know, you've trained yourself to really perform to the best you can in that scenario. Alright, that's all. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Super excited to see you all at the VCE exam revision series. See you there.
Thank you, Chelsea. So we'll be breaking till 7, so we'll be coming back at 7. So see you then.
Hey, my name is Tiana and I will be leading the psychology exam revision session where we will go through all of the points in the study design, teach you tips and tricks on how to answer questions effectively to get full marks, and help you ace the exam this year. The exam revision series is a perfect opportunity to see everything you need to know about the exam, make sure that you know everything and you don't have any gaps in knowledge, and ask questions to recent graduates who also sat the same exam as you will be. I am currently studying psychology and I really love it because it answers the questions of why and how do different processes happen in our life. For example, how does memory work? How does learning works? Which is what we will be going through in the exam revision series. A study tip for me, which I am still doing with all my learning objectives, would be to get all the points from the study design and use them in your note taking when you are revising for the exam, just to make sure that you know everything. Highlight the important aspects and the key words, and then go underneath and just write all your notes, and yeah, just make sure that you're familiar with everything, because the study design really is very important for you. Thank you for watching. We're very excited to see you in the VCE exam revision series this year with Skyline Hatch.
Okay, thank you, Theano. So we're going to move on to Q&A, and there's a question in the chat asking, I thought ICT would act between both inclusion and exclusion. Definitely. So let me just go back to the slide for 1 second. So think of these as like they're all interacting with each other, like it's not polar, like opposites. So when you are doing an evaluate question, and for this instance, this was actually on my exam in 2020. So there is a possibility that it might come up this year, but it was evaluate the ICT impacts on community. But it's best to have inclusion and exclusion. Same with ethnicity, you want to have barriers and enablers, because when you write your essay and you're only putting in exclusion, or you write your essay on ethnicity and you only write barriers, then it's not very much a whole well-rounded essay, and you actually haven't evaluated, because you need to consider both sides. But yeah, definitely ICT does both. It does inclusion and exclusion. I hope that makes sense. Okay, and then with the final area of study, hopefully this is more fresh in your minds, but this is social movements. And this is probably one of the more, I think, recent years, it's kind of been a little bit more challenging with the questions that they're putting out. So let's just go through the content now. So for social movements, we have this theory where it asks about the emergence. So how does the social movement come about? So social movements are formed with the purpose of creating social change, as members of the social movement have perceived inequality and believe that there has to be something to be done in order to achieve their desired goals. So they have aims to achieve their ultimate goal, and their emergence can be explained by the two theories, which is deprivation theory and the new social movements theory. So with deprivation theory, it explains the emergence usually because people are feeling deprived of, deemed valuable qualities in society, such as money, justice, status, or privilege. And then they join social movements to readdress that and really redress their grievances. So they're deprived in comparison to others. Individuals in the social movement, they believe that they have the right to more power or money or opportunities. And then it describes emergence of the social movement in pre-1960s. So that's the Black Lives Matter, Australia marriage equality, and Australian suffragettes. And with this theory, even though it says pre-industrial 1960s, it's the theory that's when it was made, if that makes sense. So we're looking at, that perceived inequality. And then on the flip side, you have new social movements theory. And this is more so your environmental, awareness. And this is more so the political aspect, or school strike for climate, or Greenpeace, etc. So we have the emergence of social movements that arise from people motivated by quality of life issues rather than economic concerns. So that's generally after 1960s, where it's environmental views or humanitarian views or animal welfare, veganism, for example. You see it more recent now than you did before 1960s, if that makes sense. So we have the typology. Once again, you actually don't need to remember that it's David Abelese, but I'm sure we all have come across how to almost distinctively label which social movement is which. So that's more of an FYI. So we have alternative social movements, so the least extreme, and that's Mothers Against Drink Driving, Planned Parenthood, and then redemptive social movements, such as religious ones. And then we have reformative social movements, women's suffrage movement, and then the revolutionary social movement. So French Revolution or Chinese Revolution. I think for this example, it's really good to have this table in your notes, because when you are defining these, you can just go to your notes and just talk about that it's limited change, and then it modifies an individual or group behavior for alternative. And then you put in an example such as Mothers Against Drink Driving. So it is, for this typology, it's very straightforward. And then with the life cycle stages, you have emergence, so the beginning, and that's when the social movement is starting, and that's the widespread discontent about an issue. And then there's no organization. It's a bit messy at the start, but there's people who are unhappy, and then they want something to be done. And then they start to have that perception of the social injustice, and then they move on to taking action, which is coalescence. And that's when the leadership emerges and the strategies are kind of defined, and they have that aims and objectives. And then this is almost as well where there's blockades and where there's mass demonstrations that may occur in order to display the movement's power and demands. The movement starts getting organized with a strategic outlook. So basically taking that action and putting it into place. And then this is after popularity, and more so this is when the social movement moves up more. And this is where the social movement starts to become more business-like, and that's bureaucratization or institutionalization. But bureaucratization is probably what you'll have to write for the exam. And that's the formalization of the movement and higher power levels. And then that's when there's formal positions, and then there's that money making and leadership roles. And it's more organized management system with rules in place, engaging paid staff, developing hierarchical leadership and management structure. And then they may have more access to media, officials, and political bodies. So there's more power involved, if that makes sense. And then the final stage is the decline. So it's no longer active. The social movement is finished. They have either failed or they've been successful, or, there's no need to be a social movement anymore, because it might have achieved its goal, like the marriage equality one, where they actually got the policy and they've passed it, and, gay marriage is now legalized. So there's no need to have the movement, persist. And then just a reminder that these stages, they're not static, so they can be fluid. Some may move more quicker than others, and it's kind of good to just use these concepts more so as a guide rather than to be narrow-headed and just have that tunnel vision with the concepts. So be open and just apply them wherever you can with the stage of your social movement. For example, with that, I think it's really good to have notes on all these. Even if it's not at the decline stage, you can still write, just a couple sentences or something, just about some evidence of what has actually occurred and what's changed and what they've achieved, because I think this is still something that you still should have in your notes as a what if it is on the exam. And then how was power used? So that's the second concept that we're going to quickly cover. And then that's, of course, Max Weber, and it's how the power was used. And I haven't put it here for the template, but it's how the power was used by the social movement and how the power was used by the opposition. So how has the social movement been challenged and kind of been pushed back, if that makes sense? And then that leads to Max Weber's theory of power. So at the start of the presentation, we all got that one right. The ability of one person or institution to influence the actions of another person or institution. So more powerful social movements have greater access to resources and then more likely to achieve social change. Individuals with power are more able to resist/repress actions of weak social movements, an attack to silence participants in social movements. So for example, if you're going against the government, it may be hard to actually be a successful social movement, if that makes sense. For example, my case study that I did was Me Too. And then you could see the opposition use their power by spreading the Him Too movement, essentially. So Me Too was essentially because Me Too was talking more so about the women's experiences, men were more obliged to undermine Me Too by having Him Too be a thing and, gain popularity and really challenge Me Too and state that women are blowing the whistle on innocent men. So it's almost making the social movement be repressed and have those actions be taken away from and then not be able to achieve the social change. And then measuring social change. This will probably appear on the exam where you are going to be asked a question relating to, well, what's changed from the social movement, and from the social movement coming about, what has occurred, what's their purpose, what has really been the driving factor for their social movement, and what's been done. So the overall impact of the social movement, what's changed, and the evidence for this, which I think is really good to have in the notes, is polls, surveys, any organizations, businesses, hotlines that may have been formed from the social movement. Me Too is a really good example. They had hotlines being made from after its popularity. And then for power, this can be exercised through media. So what logos/slogans are the social movements using? How they utilizing social media, for example, and then how is the social movement getting their message across? So is it fear? Is it almost like Greenpeace, where they're doing all these random actions in public? Just an example. And then is it political networks, people power, economic resources? What do they have and what are they utilizing? And just some evidence from my case studies last year, I had #MeToo movement. It's made this increase in speaking about, sexual assault and people being more vocal about domestic violence and seeking that support. And as well as that, there's been the flip side where actually after Me Too, men are actually hesitant and reluctant to hire attractive women. And this was shown in the survey. I forgot her name. I think the sociologist who did the survey, her name's Leanne. But basically, even though there has been really good impacts and all these hotlines been happening, you need to think of, well, what's the negative? What's the bad side of things? And as well as that, the Be Heard Act. So addressing the impact of Me Too at work and being able to get rid of non-disclosure agreements, really challenging the before and what the problems with American society before, if that makes sense. And then for questions on social change, so really good to have these to look at after the presentation, but referring to one social movement, evaluate the degree to which the actions of the movement's opposition have affected the ability of the social movement to achieve its goals, and then evaluate the ability, pretty much the same question repeated. And this is on 2 different exams. And my biggest tip for this is to use evidence from case studies to answer these questions. Like in the previous slide, you use those things to really back up the evidence and those arguments. And then once again, we have example social movement representations. One on the right is really relevant. So it's pretty much hashtag him too, and it asks, when you're doing these representations, what is the social movement? What's the type of social movement? So is it redemptive, alternative, revolutionary? And then how can you tell? So you're starting to look at, are they targeting an individual or a group or whole society? And is it a limited social change or is it radical social change? And then is it, for the representation, is it negative or positive? And how is it shown? And then as well as that, how is power being demonstrated? So what are they doing and how are they exercising that power and what are they trying to do? Like using the definition as well, what are they doing despite the people pushing against them? So what has the opposition done to really repress the social movement? So for example, him too, it's really trying to gain popularity online and really trying to gain popularity as well and hijack the Me Too movement. So for example, saying that your son isn't safe or your grandson isn't safe. So it's really instilling that fear as well. And then on the flip side, we have the hashtag Me Too movement gave women the power to say no, and that's an opinion. So we're looking at the social change that, actually women are now speaking up about this and are being more vocal. And then just in the middle here, just a random one that I also found that it's more of an environmental one, but with this social movement, is it actually the question isn't here, but is it a new social movement? Can it be explained by the new social movement theory, or can it be explained by deprivation theory? And then you would pretty much write, well, it's based on environmental values and people aren't really deprived of their wealth or their opportunities. And once again, just a couple more takeaways, but the one on the left, justice for captives, it's pretty much been on the exam before, and it's asking how are they exercising their power to achieve their social movement's goals despite in the face of resistance. So using that Max Weber's definition, what you'd do is you define power and you'd also talk about how the power is being exercised. So pretty much, justice for captives, what they've done is they've gone to SeaWorld and they've put out all these signs saying animals are not entertainment and captivity is cruel, and just turning people away from SeaWorld and engaging with the zoo as well. But of course, with the flip side of the opposition, always consider that, well, the opposition, which is SeaWorld, they're opposing the social movement by, kicking them out of SeaWorld, of course, and trying to get security to really repress them and silence their message. And then on the right, just Youth for Climate, what's the current stage? Which theories can explain this social movement? How can you explain them? So explain what gives it away that it is, is it a deprivation? Can it be explained by deprivation theory, or can it be explained by new social movement theory? And, tell me why. And then for an example, we have this VCAR sample. And if you haven't accessed the VCAR sample exam paper, they release it as a teaser of what could be on the exam. And there's a lot of questions there that you can also practice, which I definitely suggest. If you haven't already looked at questions, you might want to look at these ones as well, because they've been actually made by VCAR. And this is just an example of a representation made by them that it hasn't been on the exam, but this is what they've made to kind of sense what you could get into and what could be shown in the exam. So for example, it's about the anti-nuclear organization. So that would be the social movement. And it's talking about, for question 1 and then question 2, both worth 5 marks each. So this would be from section A, and it's asking to describe the nature and purpose of the social movement, featured in that representation in terms of type, stage, and influence on social change. And then the second question is compare how power is used by the social movement featured in representation 3 and by its opposition. So then you're considering what is the anti-nuclear movement doing, and then you're looking at what the opposition is doing and trying to repress their message, if that makes sense. And I think, okay, I'm just gonna check questions. Sorry. Okay, can I get the link to these slides? Yep, in the chat. Okay, yes. Okay, that's all the questions. I think this is just this has been answered. So that's pretty much concluding this presentation. There will definitely be a recording available, so don't stress if you haven't been able to write down everything. That's fine. Definitely come back to this, and you can always pause it, rewind. Yeah, no problem, Lola. And just note that we do have sessions tomorrow, a full day of further maths. I did further maths. I won't be sitting on in the presentation, but it's taught by some wonderful tutors. EAL, really, really good as well. Literature, psychology, and specialist maths on Friday. And as well as that, before you leave, I'd love for all of you to fill out the form in the chat. Tell me feedback for next year and how we can improve. And as well as that, you have a chance to win $50. So please do it. And yeah, Susan, anything to add?
No, I guess just good job on showing up today. You've taken the time out of your holidays and sort of later in the evening to commit to some revision. So it's really great to see all of you come along. Thank you. Please do fill out that survey before you leave, because it really does help us out a lot. And who doesn't want to win $50?
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, thanks so much, everyone. And all of your engagement, your answers in the chat and then the Menti have been fantastic as well. So I'm sure you will all do amazing in your exam this year.
Yes, good luck. Good luck. No problem, Alice.
So the survey link's just in the chat. I've been posting it in there. How does that work? Can everyone see that okay? Can't click the link. I'm not sure.
All good, Rania.
Not sure why you wouldn't be able to click the link, Alice. Thanks, everyone.
All good, Isabella. No problem. Have a lovely night, everyone, as well, and good luck. You'll all do amazing. Trust.
I've posted it again, Alice. I don't know if that helps. I just sent the link by itself.
All good, Fatima.
Thanks so much, everyone. Did you want to pop the music on while finish up the survey? That's very true. I feel like it's good to get the English out of the way, and then you're like, yeah, I can write essays under pressure. It's all good.
Yeah, I know. Like, I feel like once you sit the English exam or the EAL exam, you can do anything after that. Like, I'm
So true.
Yes.
If anyone here's still hanging around, feel free to pop any last minute questions in the chat, or let us know if you're having any issues filling out the survey. But thanks so much, everyone.